The opinions expressed in the following video are not in their entirety endorsed by this podcast. They are instead the focus of our discussion today. This is your content warning.
Jesus ate with sinners, but didn't condone their activity either. Jesus is meant to change the sinner, not sinners change who Jesus is. You know, a lot of people would say, man, Jesus never changed. Well, a lot of us forget that Jesus was a product of the culture as well. Like, he came in as a Near Eastern Palestinian Jew. He spoke Aramaic. He literally embodied the culture. He became the culture to reach the culture. Like, it's crazy to think that, you know, he changed the culture. And I get it. He did change the culture, but he also became a part of the culture, right? He became a part of the culture to create culture. I think that we want to isolate ourselves from culture so much and be so distinct that we are ineffective.
Episode 35, Joshua, 35. You realize that? That means that the next episode we release, not this one, but the next one, we'll have officially been doing this for 3 years.
That's wild, man. I mean, 36 doesn't sound like that many, but when you do one a month, that's crazy.
Well, that's like, you think about some guys that podcast, if that's what you want to call us at this point, as podcasters. But like, I don't know how often, like, you do the Better Bid Callers podcast. I don't know how often that releases.
That's once a month, yeah.
Well, so that one's once a month, but like, you know, guys that post once a week or 1 or 2 times a week, like 36 episodes is nothing. You know, that's you know, just over half the year. And so we've been doing this for 3 years now.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
But it's crazy. We were just talking about how like 2018 seems like yesterday, right? And that was 6 years ago now. And so we've been doing this for 3 years, which absolutely nuts. But guys, thank you so much for hanging in there with us. If you've been here from the beginning, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I have no idea. But if you have, we sincerely appreciate it. And we want to welcome you back to the Content Warning Podcast. This is a Bible Meets Culture podcast where we break down biblical content versus modern theology. I'm excited about this one, Joshua, because this was a big controversy that we didn't jump on right at the front end of it. So this is something that has, and I'll set the context for us here in a second, but this was a kind of a big deal, maybe 4-ish months ago, somewhere in that realm. But before we get into that, Joshua, I'll let you introduce our guest, because you spoke so highly of him before he even logged on. He wouldn't even say it to your face, but I'm going to give him a chance to do that now. So,
well, I do think very highly of our guest today. Chris Elrod is the youth minister at the Walter Hill Church of Christ on the other side of Murfreesboro from me. And Chris is a graduate of Freed-Hardeman, a very wonderful fella who I think very highly of. And he's going to have a lot of good things to say for us today. I just know it. So glad that Chris could be on with us.
Yeah, I appreciate you being on. Joshua cares about you when he refers to you as fella and not
fella.
That's a term for those that are not from the South. That is a term of endearment, is when you just end the word with an A. But anyway,
yeah, I'm certainly glad to be here. I appreciate y'all inviting me. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So,
well, we hope so. So for those of you that have just seen or heard the video that we're talking about, I'll set a little bit of the context. This is a response. So this is actually, it was kind of funny because I asked Joshua right before we got on, I was like, do you have any idea who this is in the video? And he said, no, not really. I said, it's Lecrae. And he said, well, it's probably not the one I'm thinking of. Turns out it is the one you're thinking of. It's the only one that I know of for that matter.
Do I look like someone who knows who Lecrae is? I mean, can we just be honest?
You look like somebody who at one point pretended to know who Lecrae was because you thought it was going to give you some sort of street cred, but I don't.
I have no idea who Lecrae is.
But anyway,
I know Lecrae is a singer. That's about
there. You go. Yeah. So Lecrae is a Christian rapper. He's been in the news a lot, actually, the last probably 6 to 8 months or so, going through a lot of transition in his own personal faith. He's been very public about it. But this is a clip that he took from a podcast, and this clip in particular, the context that I want to set is this is Lecrae talking about the Jesus Gets Us ad campaign that was released back in the Super Bowl. And like I said, we didn't really jump out on the front end of that. There was a lot of content out there at the time about the Jesus Gets Us campaign and the washing feet advertisement. That was a big part of the Super Bowl. If you haven't seen that, then I feel like you might be living under a rock a little bit. If you haven't seen that ad or heard of what I'm talking about, chances are you're probably not listening to this. So there's that. But this was a response to that. So what Lecrae did was he gave a whole podcast worth of breakdown and initial reaction and really his take on the entire campaign of the Jesus Gets Us and the feet washing commercial that was taking place. And the video that we're talking about today is actually his response to somebody who commented in that particular video. Because one of the big criticisms about the Jesus Gets Us campaign, about the feet washing commercial that was in the Super Bowl, is this idea that there were a lot of opposite ends of the spectrums washing each other's feet, right? And you had this concept. I think one of the last images that you see is Jesus washing the feet of somebody who is clearly part of the LGBTQ. I'm leaving out an initial there somewhere, community. And the tagline of the whole thing was Jesus didn't hate, Jesus washed feet. And so that's kind of the lead into the Lecrae video. The commenter on Lecrae's video actually said something along the lines of Jesus, essentially what a lot of Christians' response to it is that Jesus did love everybody. Jesus didn't share hate, but Jesus was there to change a lot of what existed. And so the response that a lot of Christians had, if you were observant over the course of that time, was washing feet is great and it's fine. But if you're going to wash somebody's feet and not try to correct the behavior that they're exhibiting, especially if that behavior is sinful, then you're not really doing any good. And so Lecrae's response to this idea of Jesus changing the culture was Jesus actually became the culture. Instead of changed it by becoming culture, I think is the phrase that he used. And so just want to talk about that for a little bit today, because I think that there's a massive gap in the world right now of Christians and culture. And we'll get into maybe some of the issues that Christians have when it comes to engaging with culture or how we can be better at that. But guys, I just wanted to get your opinion on your first impressions of the particular video that we're talking about.
Well, I want to like the video. That's how a lot of these podcasts starts.
Sure.
I'll look at it and I'm like, there's an element of truth there. The nuance of the element of truth is problematic in a lot of situations with these videos. I want to like the video. I want to say that, Jesus and culture can blend very well together. But that is, and that comes from an Americanized way of thinking. I'm reading a book now, and honestly, you guys need to read it if you haven't, and all of our listeners need to read it. It's called Life in the Negative World. And basically it explores how starting around 2005, this is the first time in American history that being a Christian has been a negative thing or perceived publicly as a negative thing.
Sure. And
so this is coming from an Americanized point of view where I say, I wish I could say that Jesus and culture blend very well together. But when you look in the Bible, I have to disagree. I don't think that Jesus has ever, I don't think Jesus ever said that culture is going to be synonymous with the kingdom. In fact, I think the opposite is true, that the kingdom is to be countercultural in every way possible. And that brings us back to the ad, that made such a big stink. It was, Jesus washed feet, but I heard a lot of people say, well, Jesus washed feet, but he didn't approve the sin, or he didn't validate the sin, or whatever. I'm like, yeah, Jesus washed feet, but in his day and age, if you want to say Jesus became the culture, he wouldn't have washed the feet of a member of the LGBTQIA plus movement, because that person would have been stoned in that culture.
Yeah.
Right. So, you can't read Scripture through 21st century Western eyes.
Sure.
You have to do some hermeneutical interpretation. So I'll leave that and let Chris talk for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah. My gut reaction to the video was, yeah, not really. like it just didn't seem, to really line up with what the Bible says about Jesus and really what the Bible says about how we are to conduct our lives. I think at some point it might be beneficial for us to kind of talk about like a working definition for the purpose of this podcast of culture, just so we kind of have an idea of, what that means. I kind of think of it as like a set of values, trends, beliefs, ideas, attitudes that shape a specific group of people in a specific place in a specific time. And so whenever you think about that and you think about the fact that Jesus became man, right? He came and dwelt among us. And in his time amongst us, he definitely did, I think, I would say more that was countercultural, right? That kicked against or rebelled against the culture of his day in order to kind of show us a better way of living. When you think about some of the things that Jesus did that were kind of like big countercultural moves, I think of things like Jesus talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman who this Jewish man is speaking to, like that would have been very countercultural. The fact that Jesus, a religious leader, was eating with sinners, that's very countercultural. That's not something that people would have accepted or expected. And Jesus takes a lot of flack for it. Like we've already talked about Jesus washing his disciples' feet. I think that's an example of Jesus doing something that was fairly countercultural, in that Jesus, this rabbi, this teacher, is washing his disciples' feet. And then, in Luke chapter 8 and verse 19 through 21, Jesus redefines what it means to be family when he says, those who do the will of God, those are my brothers, my sisters. That was like so countercultural, especially as we think of like the first century world and how important family is. And so, I think that there's a whole lot to be said about Jesus going and being more countercultural than being more culturally in-lined.
Sure. No, like I said, I tracked with both of you. That was my initial reaction to it was essentially Jesus was, if he became culture, he did a really poor job of it. This concept of Jesus became the culture so well that he was ridiculed his whole life. That guys chased him down and tried to catch him in a screw up his entire ministry. He was wrongfully accused, drugged through a bit of a kangaroo court, and crucified and killed because of how, like, if that was becoming culture, Jesus did a really bad job of it. And maybe I'm oversimplifying. And maybe, like I said, Chris, to your point, there's so many gaps that we try to fill within this particular podcast because of the clips and what they try to do, right? They try to be just enough of this sounds okay, but there's also it doesn't sound okay at the same time type deal. And so this idea of Jesus was born into culture, sort of, right? Like I think we can all agree Jesus was born into a real family who lived in a real place in a real time, who observed real customs. There are several of those recorded for us. And so Jesus did grow up within a specific culture, but I think when you look at the ministry of Jesus specifically, Jesus was very quick to ignore a lot of the culture around him. So this idea of becoming culture, unless he was becoming a new culture, and I think you can make that argument, but sure, it wasn't a new culture that was well received in any way.
Right. Right.
There's a couple of things that you have to unpack there. So
sure,
when Christ came into the world, he did so in space and time, and both of you have pointed that out, and that's absolutely true. And so what that means is there are certain cultural mores or the things that we do in culture without even thinking about it that are going to be part of his human experience. Like the video talks about, he spoke Aramaic. Others have made a good argument for Jesus speaking Greek. But anyways, he spoke a language of the culture of his day. We read in the Gospel of John that he celebrated Hanukkah. He celebrated the Feast of Lights. Those are cultural mores. When he goes to the wedding at Cana in John 2, we know what's going to be entailed there because the culture defines the ceremony. So we have those things. What Jesus does, I'm going to agree with Nathan, but I'm going to take it and kind of flip it. I don't think he's making another culture. I think he's doing something that Israel itself should have done, which is uphold the culture that God stated in the law of Moses.
Sure.
And so what Jesus is doing is, I don't think he's starting something new. I think he's reforming the old.
Sure.
And that's what he does in his death, burial, and resurrection, with being the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice that the book of Hebrews talks about.
Yeah. And along those same lines, kind of his teaching is very countercultural as well. Like in Matthew chapter 5, you've heard it said, the cultural belief is this,
right?
But I'll tell you that God actually intended this, and the ideas of like loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, all of that, very countercultural. And still
the
today
funny thing
is
Chris,
countercultural.
The funny thing is, there are things in the Sermon on the Mount that assume a cultural setting. So when Jesus says, if someone asks you to go with them a mile, go two, the cultural response is, this is a Roman soldier asking you to carry their armor for 1 mile, which you are obligated to do by cultural law, and your job is to go 2, which is countercultural, right? Doing more than what's asked of you, it's countercultural. But it's also defined by the cultural expectation.
Sure. And there's, there's other examples of Jesus, just in the way that he presents the Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of culture that we see there, and the fact that, it talks about Jesus being seated on a mountain. We don't think about prisoners being seated today, right? Because in our culture, prisoners stand and everyone else sits. But, in the first century, Jesus sat down in order to make this presentation, so there's definitely, we see him, definitely live in a culture, but that culture is only embraced in a way that will glorify God.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so for like good example of that, I say good example, this is just my antidote to that. I have pitched that idea here before of why don't everybody else stand up and I'll sit down and preach Sunday morning. And for whatever reason, nobody liked that idea. It was just
I did
me.
that.
I
preached
know
the Sermon on the
you.
Mount.
It's like I know you've done that, but
I sat
you're
down
also
on the stage and preached it. They didn't like it.
Yeah, see, I mean, so it's there is some cultural stuff, but as always, I want to be able to give credit where credit is due, because I do think that Lecrae, even though I think maybe the large spectrum he might have swung and missed, I want to talk about maybe a couple of things that he got right. If you guys picked anything out of the video that he got right, because the one thing that I really agreed with in this particular video is the sense of, maybe not as far as he took it, but there's part I'm not sure if I agree with. There's part that I absolutely do agree with. And he made a comment about how in order for Christians to be able to impact the culture, they need to be in the culture, right? And I think that was kind of the trail that he was following. Like, Jesus became culture in order for him to change the culture. We can argue about whether or not that's accurate or not. But he made a comment about how Christians need to be able to do that too. And he said for him, he's afraid that too many Christians try to isolate themselves completely from culture. And in doing so, they kind of become their own thing, and there's no chance for them to reach or change anything. And I could not agree with that more. Now, I'm not saying that I think Christians should set out to win the culture war. I don't know that it's possible. I don't know that it should be an expectation for Christians to win the culture war, especially when the Bible fills us with warnings about how, the world will reject you because it first rejected me. That being said, I do think that there is a tendency for Christians to want to distance themselves from things that'll make them look worldly, that we actually end up distancing ourselves from the world completely. And in doing so, we kind of handcuff ourselves to truly evangelize those that are lost. And so I thought he really, like I said, giving credit where credit's due, I think he was right on point with that particular thought.
So do you have an example?
How you mean? As far as Christians being like not wanting to be?
Like give me an example of And obviously, I'm not telling you to call
No,
anyone out or
I
anything,
got you.
but give me an example of Christians isolating themselves to a point to where they become ineffective.
Well, okay, so let me again from my point of view, I think it's more of a public relation thing. So, like, I grew up at a particular church who we were asked by a downtown association in order to participate in a service project. Where I grew up didn't, and the service project was we were painting the parking places downtown. They had the downtown court square roped off for a few hours, and we were painting parking places. They had asked where I went to church, and then they had asked 3 other denominational churches who were all on the right within the downtown section to come be like a joint community part of this. Where I grew up chose not to participate in that. Because they didn't want to see that as being associated with other quote unquote types of
Sure.
religion. And so
Sure.
I think that there's more of a negative image that places on the church than the positive that comes from, in my mind at the time, painting parking places, right? Like there's no sense in doing that. I think that there are instances where Christians probably care more so above tradition and comfort than they do above people. And so, for any of us that have had or dealt with any extent benevolence cases that may show up to church, it's pretty obvious who people don't want to sit by at times, especially if said person smells bad or something along those lines. We have a tendency to maybe go out a different way than we normally would have in order to avoid conversation or interaction with. Just from my observation, I'm not saying every Christian does this. I think these are the ones that unfortunately get highlighted sometimes. But I think that there's a tendency for Christians to not want to look like the world, and therefore don't associate with the worldly. Now, full acknowledgement up front, I understand there's a fine line between associating with and condoning certain types of behavior, right? I think that that's the line that every Christian strives to walk, and I think every Christian maybe draws that line in a different place.
Sure.
And so,
Well,
But I
let
think-
me add something to what you said, Nathan.
sure,
To me, with everything that has been said to this point, it's literally the opposite of the seeker sensitive movement. So what the seeker sensitive movement has done in churches is it said our doors are open to anybody. Okay, I think we would all agree about that.
Mhm.
Like that's, yeah, of course we want people
Sure.
to come. But because we want you to be comfortable,
yeah,
we're not going to ask you any questions. We're not going to ask you to change your lifestyle.
Sure.
If you have a lifestyle that doesn't go with Scripture, just come as you are and leave as you are, and that's what
Sure.
the seeker sensitive movement does.
well,
But what we do is we say, "Come to us." When the Great Commission says, and to Nathan's point, "Go into the world."
yeah,
Right. So I've changed my thinking about the church building as a mission field. The church building is not a mission field. The church building and Sunday morning worship, that is there for Christians to
sure,
worship and honor God. And if somebody wants to come and visit and be part of that, great. That's a way for them to hear, and hearing is the first step in
Sure.
salvation. I certainly acknowledge that. But mission work takes place out there. Like it takes place in
100%.
the world.
yeah,
And I agree with Nathan. I think Christians have lost that because we've said, well, I'll have this program and this activity and this game night and this, free food giveaway. And that's what will bring people in.
yeah.
Well, Christ didn't call us to open the doors and say, come. He said, go
Sure.
into all the world.
Well, and to your point, Joshua, like I'm never gonna discourage somebody from inviting their friends to come worship.
Of course.
Okay, like that's not what we're talking about. But I think I think the church has relegated a lot of personal responsibility to a select few within the church, i.e., preachers, youth ministers, elders, maybe some
Right.
deacons.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is definitely a problem. I think we've definitely kind of sidetracked a little bit, but like I definitely think like to some degree that people inviting people to church is the way in which they are most equipped to do evangelism. Now,
Exactly.
I'm not saying and that's not how it necessarily should be at all. Again,
Right,
I think that's
right.
A
And I think,
cultural
too, when people
problem
bring
within the
people-
church right now.
I think too, when people bring people to church, what they're doing, they may not know they're doing it, but what they're doing is they're saying, I did my part. Now, preacher, elder, deacon, Bible class teacher, whatever, now it's your turn.
Sure.
to make sure these people become Christians rather than it being a Christian, an individual Christian responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, that's definitely a problem that needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
That
Well, and like I
is
said,
rooted deeply within our culture.
100%, and that may be a whole nother podcast. We've kind of hinted at that before, Joshua. That there's almost, especially now within the what we'll call the broad religious community, there's so much of that. This idea of come as you are, stay as you are, leave as you are. That it's prevented us from maybe taking certain stances on things. To the extent of within the broad scheme religious community, there's as long as you believe in Jesus, as long as you think that you should follow what he says, everything else is just kind of up for debate. Everything else is opinion based. There's no real sense of right or wrong, as long as we can acknowledge that Jesus is who he is, right?
Well, what we've done is we've created Jesus in our image rather than us being conformed to his.
Oh, absolutely.
So I see this. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that gives me an opportunity to jump back in, because I was going to actually say, well, I definitely see Nathan's point going back to his examples that he gave in the ways that the church can kind of isolate themselves, or Christians can isolate themselves.
Sure.
I look at like the example of, someone not sitting next to someone who smells, who's visiting church, and kind of isolating themselves from that situation. I look at that from the perspective of not us being like the world, but us being too much like the world, right?
Mm.
Let me clarify. I'm saying like us not being willing to sit next to the person that smells is because we're too much like the culture instead of being too much like Jesus,
Sure.
And when you look at like the other example, the church example, I think we're now talking about it in a way that I had not really looked at it. Like whenever I watched the video, I was definitely thinking about like an individual living out their life for Christ versus, the community of believers. Maybe there's a difference there. I don't know. I think that
So when I think of, and just even talking about it from an individual perspective, what I see in culture currently, Chris, kind of going back to your point, when he says in the video that Christians have a tendency to remove themselves from culture, there was a mentality, and I don't know exactly when it started, but there's a preacher that I've listened to who refers to it as the Jesus is my homeboy movement. And what it is this concept of my relationship, me and Jesus. That's all that matters, right? Jesus is my homeboy. That's all, me and him. That's it. And we forget that if we focus too much, I'm not saying that having a personal relationship with Jesus is a bad thing, but if we get to the point where we focus too much on it's just me and him, then we've completely ignored a massive aspect of what Christianity is, and that being that we are supposed to go and reach those that are lost. And so I think that there is. I think that that's kind of what we've all been hinting at, right? There's a tendency for the church to be so internally focused that we forget that there's an external mission or an outward focused mission.
Sure.
You have to remember that in 1 Corinthians 3, the word you is plural when Paul says, do you not know the Spirit of God lives in you? It's you all.
Yeah, it's
right. The collective there, the church. But then in chapter 6, it's singular.
Yeah.
So, it's do you not know that the Holy Spirit dwells in you personally as an individual? So to your point, Nathan, a personal relationship with the Lord obviously is
huge
important.
Part. 100%.
Every building needs one brick, but you also need all the other bricks too, in order to make this temple where God is present.
And I feel as if the culture, let's say the world, I feel as if the world is benefited more by Christians being less like the culture. Like his whole point there at the end, I actually wrote it down and said, he said, I think that we want to isolate ourselves from culture so much and be so distinct that we are ineffective. I think that maybe we're ineffective because we're too much like the world. We're willing to, not sit next to the person who smells because I shower and I'm only going to associate with people who shower. That's a fairly worldly, perspective, when Jesus has called us for so much more. You think about like Romans 12:2 to be transformed rather than conformed to the world. Being a light in Matthew chapter 5. So many passages of Scripture call us to be different from the world, and I think that we reach out to the lost more when we are more like Jesus, when we have that mindset of seeking those who are lost.
Sure.
So like that was honestly my biggest takeaway was my disagreement with that statement.
Yeah, I got you.
Ironically.
No, I completely see where I completely see that perspective, because I do think that's a valid point. And so, but like I said, I do think you had some truth in there, some right in there. But as always, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and to your point, I think when Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 22, I became all things to all people. Like Paul's point was, in order to reach the lost, I became, who I needed to become to reach that person. And I definitely think that there's an application there, right? Where we definitely do have to be willing to get out of our comfort zone, take interest in other people's interests, learn about things that we need to learn about to connect with someone else in order to reach them with Jesus. But ultimately,
the mission field teaches you that. If the three of us were to take a week-long mission trip to Japan, we would have to change a lot about how we think.
Sure.
We would really have to do that in order to reach those people, or even something more extreme like going somewhere in the Middle East. The clothing we wear would have to change. We would have to be careful about if we made eye contact with a woman. I mean, seriously, we would have to really think about the cultural mores that they have versus the ones that we have.
Well, I mean, and even think about some cultures, and again, I couldn't tell you which ones. Maybe this, for all I know, this may be completely made up that I read sometime in like the 8th grade and just stuck, right? But there are some cultures where shaking with your right hand versus your left hand, one of those is insulting and one of those is respectful, right? I mean, it's simple.
Showing the bottom of your shoe.
Right. I mean, simple things like that really make a massive difference. But put a bookmark in 1 Corinthians 9, because we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But it gives us a chance to maybe switch gears for just a second, right? Because we'd like to talk about what's right. But a lot of the reason that we talk about the videos that we talk about is because there is some stuff in there, if not mostly stuff in there that's wrong. So what was, and again, we've kind of talked about it already in the sense of Jesus becoming culture and this sort of concept. But what was a big wrong takeaway, I guess, from you guys? What were some of the red flags, I guess?
Well, I think for me, the idea predominantly, and we've talked about it already, largely, but the idea that culture defined Jesus to the point where Jesus is bound by culture, that to me totally ignores the actions and teachings of Jesus. To the point where he said that Jesus became the culture.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that goes back to what Chris was saying at the very beginning of the episode. Jesus did so many things that were countercultural that made sense because it was within a cultural setting in space and time.
Exactly.
But mentally, intellectually, even morally in some cases, he did those things that went against the culture. It's kind of like if you have a river and then a boat sitting on the river, you need the river in order to make the boat float. But the boat can also travel upriver against the stream while still being on the water. And I think that's all illustrations are imperfect, but that's kind of the way I view Jesus in the culture that he lived. He had to have the water, he had to have the culture in order to be in space and time. But the things that he does go against the culture. He drove upstream in a way that there was resistance, but he was still able to overcome.
When I think about Jesus as like a product of the culture, if that is true, and this is kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but if Jesus is a product of the culture, he's a product of the culture in that what he taught was correcting the cultural problems of his time. You know what I mean? Like he very much so is addressing things that were wrong within that culture in the first century.
Well, if you take Jesus as a first century Jew from, the Judean region of Bethlehem and the Galilean region and all that you have to have a historical cultural context in which to operate. So like when Jesus is 12 years old, he goes to the temple, right? Well, you need to understand why that would be. Why did they go to the temple?
Right.
And if memory serves me, I think it was for Passover. So, they do this every year. It's an annual thing. Well, is that religious? Yes, but is it also, because like there's no separation between religion and culture in the first century. They're so blended together, which in our culture today, in the 21st century, we separate church and state so much that you guys go to your building and you do what you want, and then everybody else is going to do what they want.
Well, Joshua, it's funny that you bring that up. I was actually having a conversation with our youth minister Sean earlier today, and we were talking about the concept of why the church today doesn't emphasize Passover as much as maybe some people think they should or shouldn't, whatever the case may be, and actually led to a conversation about whether or not after the first century church was established, if a lot of those same people still celebrated Passover. And Sean and I our argument is that, yeah, they probably did. And Sean actually used, maybe this is a bad example. I don't want to throw him under the bus if it is. But there was actually an illustration that one of us brought up about, it would be similar if you, like Joshua, you and I converted to Islam, but still celebrated the 4th of July. Right, like there would still probably be a celebration of sorts in there, even though the meaning of it might not have been the same from a religious perspective. And again, part of that is because is how intertwined religion and culture were in the first century versus today, and that's that kind of goes back to what you said earlier about trying to read Scripture with 21st century glasses. We're really bad about that in a lot of ways. But anyway, I didn't mean to derail us even more, but I thought that was a valid point. So let me ask you guys this, because I think that this whole video kind of hints around something that I think maybe the church struggles with. I'm not 100% sure. I think it might just vary on a person-to-person basis. But I've heard this accusation made before against Christians in general. Is there, when you look at Jesus being countercultural and cultural all at the same time, you look back at maybe or Paul becomes a big example of this, right? Wanting to be countercultural, but also bending to the culture of the time. Paul becomes maybe a key person of scrutiny when he writes his letter to Philemon. Why wouldn't he try to say something about slavery? Why would something immoral and terrible like that be allowed within culture, even though Jesus was supposed to be this countercultural person? So is there even today a conflicting message to Christians or from the church about the world when you look at passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul says, I had to become all things to all men in order so the gospel could be spread. But then you look at maybe places like John 17, where Jesus says, I'm not of the world, right? Or for Joshua, you mentioned 1 John 2, 15 through 17, where it says, don't love the world or things of the world, because if anybody loves the world, the Father is not in him. And so is there a conflicting message? Now, I know that once you go into, like Joshua, I know Joshua can't help himself because it's going to happen. Once you go into a deep hermeneutical breakdown, it starts to make a little bit more sense. But when you look at this from the church's perspective, because we actually had this conversation, because Joshua, before we started recording, you and I talked about this, because those things that you hear over and over and over and over again within a church setting, and then you try to find that said thing in the Bible and you realize that it was never there. Right? So this idea of Christians are supposed to be in the world, but not of the world, right? There's a lot of different places that we pull that from, but that exact phrase isn't actually there. And so is there a conflicting message? And is that conflicting message, if there is a conflicting message, is that doing more harm than good from an internal perspective, or maybe even the perspective of evangelism of the church?
Well, I want to go back to what you said earlier about the church.
I didn't say it, so.
Yeah, you did. About the church having trouble with going out into the world and being evangelistic in that sense. And I think it's because we have forgotten how to become all things to all people while still maintaining our role as Christian. So
or certain integrity.
But then again, let me give the other side of the spectrum here. I have heard Christians who enjoy going to bars and hanging out there because I'm becoming all things to all people. I've had more Bible studies in the bar than you've ever had in a church office. Sure. Okay, fair enough. And that may well be true. But we have to remember when Paul becomes all things to all people, he's saying, I'm adopting some of their cultural mores for the furthering of the gospel.
Sure.
Paul never, I don't see where Paul ever engages in sinful behavior in order to reach the lost. I don't see where Paul ever adopts a sinful mindset in order to reach the lost. But what Paul does is he knows his audience. And, the three of us preach on a regular basis. And I tell the people at Salem Creek, we have a very biblically literate congregation here. We can get a lot deeper in our Bible classes here, even in just a general auditorium class, than I would at, a 30 to 50 member country congregation. That's not a knock against them. I'm just saying we have a different demographic.
Watch it. Yeah,
I'm not.
Watch it.
I'm not. But when I go speak at those 50 member congregations,
sure,
I'm not going to speak the same way that I do here. We're not going to throw around Greek and Hebrew and historical, cultural, and narrative criticism and all that stuff. So I become to them what they need.
Sure.
As a minister. And I think that is what Paul is getting at. It has nothing to do with adopting the sinful reality of the world in order to promote righteousness, because that's contradictory. I don't see how you can do that.
Absolutely.
Well, and the other point of that, Joshua, to your the train of thought that you were whatever the word is, the train of thought that you were following or chasing, whatever the word. One of the big things that I see with Paul, the idea of becoming all things to all people. I think that culture, the church, and I'm going to use that term very broadly, religion, organized religion as a whole, I think is taken that currently way too far, to the extent of, well, we need to become all things to all people, therefore we have to present a message that is as inclusive as possible. And I think in doing so, what we've seen is the truth significantly compromised in a lot of ways. And Joshua, you and I have said this before on this podcast, you can make the Bible say whatever you want it to say. If you have no Bible knowledge whatsoever, if you've never been taught how to sit down and critically think about Scripture, you can find just about anything that will make you feel and it will sound very good to you, regardless of whether or not it's true. And that's a problem that we currently have in culture today. And I don't mean that in a sense of I don't think that it's always. Sometimes it is, but I don't think that it's always done with malicious intent. I think it was if I want to reach as many people as possible, then maybe I need to reconsider some things, right? And so we need to have this very inclusive message. And when you do that, as inclusive as the gospel is, and I think we've allowed that term to be hijacked because the gospel is incredibly inclusive. The gospel includes every single person, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right? But that term has become something that has compromised truth in a lot of ways.
Well, let me add one thing, and then I'll let Chris go. It's if you look in 1 Corinthians 9, you have to look at the context. And Paul only talks about becoming two things. It says, to the Jew, I became like a Jew. To the Gentile, I became like a Gentile, with reference to how he adheres to the law. Because if you don't adhere to the law, particularly the food laws and matters of circumcision and holy days, a Jew is not going to listen to you.
Right.
But that stuff means absolutely nothing to a Gentile.
Right.
So to me, I would liken that to, if Kayla and I, again, to use our mission trip example, if we went to Egypt on a mission trip, she better be wearing one of those head garbs and whatnot. And she, over there, you have to have a ring on your finger if you're a woman to show that you belong to a man. And if you don't, it's very dangerous. She better be doing those things. So she would become like an Egyptian to the Egyptians, so to speak.
Right.
And then whatever cultural things I would have to do. I don't see anywhere in becoming like a Jew or becoming like a Gentile where, okay, well, the Gentiles believe that if you're going to worship this god or goddess, you have to go to the temple and have these like parties and raging orgies and all this stuff. Like, yeah, I don't think Paul would have been part of that to try to reach them.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. Sin's never okay.
Yeah.
Like, period. Right? Like, sin is never okay, period. Like, that has to be kept in mind. We don't want to participate in anything that put Jesus on the cross as Christians, and I think that's what we've got to keep in mind. And, in those same regards, in thinking about like forgetting what it is like. I think Josh mentioned us forgetting what it's like to be all things to all people, and has done a great job in defining that for us. But I think along those same lines, we have forgotten that we are exiles in this world. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11 talks about the fact that we're exiles here. We sing about how this world is not our home. We're just passing through, but we live our life like we're just passing through. Because if we live our life like we're just passing through, like, hey, we know we're headed to a place where we want to take other people. And so therefore we want to talk about where we're headed. And I think part of becoming all things to all people is, speaking the truth in love, like Paul taught the Ephesians to do in chapter 4 and verse 15 of Ephesians. I think that's such an important aspect of being all things and all people, so that we are communicating in a way that they will understand what we're saying, yes, but also understand the love that we have for them and the love that Christ has for them. We talk a lot about the importance of being a friendly youth group here at Walter Hill. And part of the reason we talk about being so friendly is because we want to make sure that we're showing others the love of Christ. Mm-hmm. I think in some way that, being friendly is a simple way of being all things to all people, because everyone appreciates friendliness, and everyone is loved by Christ and needs to be shown that they're loved by Christ. Yeah. And so, I think like that's a huge part of being all things to all people. And the other thing I'll say is, goes back to being a light. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through 16, the whole point of being a light is so that people will see our good works and glorify God. Yeah. If what we're doing to reach other people does not glorify God, it's not worth doing, right? Yeah. Like it's off the tracks, off the list of good ideas, right? Like it's just not the way that we should go, because ultimately our whole purpose in being a light is so that others will see what we do and look for God, glorify God, and worship Him.
Yeah. I work for an auction company that sells heavy equipment, and we do it all completely online. We're in front of a camera with 3 computer screens, and that's how people bid. But it's live. It's a live auction, but you're there with online bidders. And the guy that I work for is a very moral, godly person. And he tells us, as the people who are on camera, he says, we want our buyers to feel the love of Jesus through the camera. And going back to what Chris said about, friendliness, that right now, friendliness is the most countercultural thing you could possibly do.
Sure.
It really is. Yeah. So when people see a smile, a handshake, a how are you, and you're genuine about it, you're showing them the love of Christ that they may not see anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you guys. I want to ask you guys one more question. We'll kind of wrap it up with this, because I think it kind of alludes to a big point. Maybe currently, maybe not, depending on the observations that you've made or the niche of culture that you're in. But when it comes to the church or even Christians, individuals reaching culture, have we missed the point? And I even let you decide what that point is, because Joshua, we've talked about it a couple of times. Shameless self-plug. If you haven't watched the episode that we recorded 1 or 2 back with Wayne Jones, you really ought to do that. But in that podcast, we talked a little bit about how the church and Christians tend to be incredibly reactionary when it comes to culture, as opposed to proactive. And unfortunately, at least in my observation, those Christians that have decided to be proactive against culture have been very proactive against culture, to the point where there is not a lot of love or grace. Words are not seasoned with salt. And so, do you think the church has maybe missed the point of what their impact is on culture? And I bring that up because I think, one, it kind of highlights the entire sum of this video, because he made the comment, like, again, we don't have to agree that Jesus became the culture, but what he did say that I thought was really correct is that, yeah, there were aspects of the culture that Jesus absolutely changed. That there was now a group of followers in existence who would move and start to grow from Acts 2 on, or even really before that, but you know what I mean, from Acts 2 on, from the establishment of the church, that really took being different from the world to heart and changed it for the better. Now, again, how they got to that point, obviously, we and Lecrae don't agree with, but I think that's the whole concept of what this video is. And so, when you look at the church today, have we missed the point? Are we trying to win a culture war with the world, or are we supposed to just be living like Jesus and doing our best to bring other people to Him? And maybe it's not an either or thing, but I feel like my personal opinion on it is I feel like when we view it as an either or, there's an obvious answer, obviously, but there's a tendency to go to one extreme or the other, right? There's a tendency for the church to either go, well, as long as you're okay with Jesus, everything else will kind of fall into place, versus, no, we need to be out there telling every single person every single thing they're doing wrong. And so that's kind of my question. I'll leave it open-ended for you guys. If you want to create a new point, that's fine. But do you think the church has missed the point as far as what its responsibility is toward the culture?
I would say we've missed the point if we are more worried about looking like the world than we are about looking like Jesus. You
Sure.
know, like I think like if we are in Christ but like the world, then what's the point? You know, like Christ has come and died on the cross so that we could be transformed, so that our lives could be completely different. You know, I love Colossians chapter 3, and one of the things Paul says in verse 4 is that when Christ appears, who is your life, right? Like when Christ appears, who is your life, like what your life is all about. When Christ comes, the person you have formed your life around and is your life. When we talk about, like, you know, we talk about things being our life all the time to exaggerate, you know, how much time we spend in them and how much we enjoy them. But here I think like Paul's saying like Christ is your life. Like it's what you do. It's what you are. Like it is the point of life. Jesus is our point of life. And so if anything but Jesus is the point of our life, you know, I think we've missed the point, you know, and we've got to be like Jesus instead of the world, you know, and that was God's plan for us from the beginning. You know, Romans 8:29 talks about how, you know, we were predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. You know, we are supposed to be like Jesus. And I think that's so important.
Absolutely.
And if we're more worried about being like the world, we've missed the point completely.
I'll take this from a ministry perspective. There was a study that was done several years ago. I think it was a long study. It was like a 5-year study that traced the sermons that preachers gave through a variety of different denominational groups and the consequences from their congregation as a result. So
Sure.
One of the sermon topics that was viewed in this was how often the preacher preached about premarital sex and how often teen pregnancies took place. They found that the more a preacher spoke about premarital sex, the more likely it was that they would have a higher rate of teen pregnancy in the congregation. You would think it would be the other way around. So to your point, Nathan, and asking, has the church missed the point? Here's what we've done wrong. We have been reactionary, and in trying to be reactionary, we are taking scriptures and formulating them together and making it say what we think the Bible says about the issue and shoving that down people's throats. 100%. I have seen, though, a transition in ministry from all different areas, but also in the church, where preachers now are picking a book of the Bible and they're saying, we're starting in chapter 1, verse 1, and we're working our way through.
100%.
That's what we're doing here. I'm preaching through Exodus and Ron is preaching through Joshua. Yeah. And, you know, it doesn't matter if it takes us 4 years. We're starting in verse 1 and we are working our way through.
Heavy hitting books to start with. Goodness.
Oh, well, we haven't started with that. I started with James and Ron started with the Gospel of John, which is a little better. But But yeah, I think really what the church is going to have to do is let the Bible be what speaks.
Sure.
And study books in their context, verse by verse, expository. Nothing wrong with topical preaching, but I think expository preaching is what's going to answer the issues in a lot of pulpits. Because like, people say, well, you didn't preach about Mother's Day on Mother's Day. I'm like, well, when I get to a passage that talks about mothers, then I'll preach about mothers.
Yeah.
But if our passage today is about something else, that's what we're going to do.
Sure.
And then you're serving the text as God intended it to be received.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you have to do.
Well, I think that there's a big misconception out there today, especially today, Joshua, and like I said, don't have enough time for it on this particular podcast, but for whatever reason, society, culture, whatever you want to put there, determined that preaching and teaching were supposed to be mutually exclusive from one another. That there was a time to teach and there was a time to preach. And from a biblical perspective, I'm not so sure that's the mold, right? That you're supposed to follow, and I think that's a big deal. I heard it. I think probably best said, as far as that topic goes. Best said, the church has become vastly more known for what it's against than what it's for.
Right.
And I think there's a problem with that. I think now, that being said, don't hear what I'm not saying. The church has to be known for both. The church has to be known for, okay, we don't tolerate sin here. We all acknowledge that there's sin in our life. Nobody is supposed to be putting themselves on a pedestal where they believe that they are above sin. But we need to understand that there are certain things that even if we struggle with them, we don't approve of them. But I think in throughout the years, there's become such a trend of here's everything that you can't, won't, shouldn't, whatever, that somewhere along the line we forgot to tell people about why we don't like those things and who we're trying to glorify by avoiding them. I think that there's got to be a shift somewhere.
Well, you can agree or disagree with him all day long, but Francis Chan's model for evangelism, in San Diego, San Francisco, wherever he was, it is very good because he's in a very heavily populated area with gay and transgender people. And people ask, how are you going to reach these people? And Francis Chan said, I'm going to teach them about Jesus. I want to make them fall in love with Jesus. And if they do, and see, this is what, and Chris alluded to this earlier, and Nathan, you have too, to say, well, just accept Jesus and that's enough. Sure. If you accept Jesus, everything else about your life has to change.
Sure.
Right.
You can't accept Jesus and stay in your sin. The two don't, it's oil and water. They don't mix.
Come broken, leave transformed.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
100%.
Yeah. For sure.
100%.
For sure. Yeah. Definitely.
Well, guys, fantastic conversation. I've quite enjoyed it. Any last thoughts, comments, hopes, dreams, dances, emotional outbursts? I'm here for it. It is what it is.
I don't know. After
Chris,
the day we've had, we might have an emotional outburst.
I'm telling you, we talked about this before we started recording. Not that we're looking for sympathy, applause, or anything like that. It has been. I think we said that the last time we got on here. We're gonna have to pick different weeks to do this, Joshua. That I don't know what them weeks are, but I'm having one of them. And so like it's just been one of them days, weeks, whatever. And so maybe we're just gonna have to pick different days or weeks to try to do this. But Chris, thank you so much for being on, man. Really enjoyed your insight. Appreciated the conversation. If you've got questions, comments, concerns, or any of that other stuff, if you found a video that you want us to talk about, right? Joshua and I do this once a month. We're hitting the tail. We're going to be at the end of season 3, man. Next month. That'll be super exciting. We'll have hit 36. Doing this for 3 years because somebody thought it'd be a good idea. I don't know. And people keep listening. So like we'll keep doing it.
And people keep sending us videos.
I know. That's the other thing. If you want to send us a video, want us to talk about something in particular that you've seen that piqued your interest, that you're struggling with, by all means, send it to us. We'll give you our 2 cents worth, or 1 cent. Well, there's 2 of us, so 2 cents. Yeah, we're worth a penny each. So we'll do something along those lines. But man, if there's nothing else, we appreciate you guys for tuning in. And until next time, man, we'll see you.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll see you next time.